I came here today to talk to you about Exquisite Corpse, which is a piece which I made on arrival at the Choreographic Center in Belfort, which is, of course, in France, right on the eastern side of France, about an hour and a half south of Strasbourg and an hour west of Basel, because no one knows where Belfort is, but it's a little town of like 50,000 people. And there's a choreographic center there, which is kind of, well, it's a structure in France that allows choreographers to become directors of dance houses, and where they're kind of involved with our own work, our own choreographic work, but also part of our role is to invite other choreographers in to share in this fantastic center for dance, which is like a kind of theater and a studio and a team of 10 people. So when I was thinking about my project for Belfort, because I postulated for Belfort like 3 years ago, I was interested in how we could kind of open that house beyond just bringing other choreographers in to make their work and to come and do what we call an accueil studio, which is like a choreographic residence where choreographers come. We have like 8 or 10 choreographers every year, and they come in residence and they make work over like a 2 or 3 week period. And having done a few of these in France or in different areas, it's not only France, but I think in France they really worked on structure and how to support artists. I was interested in, like not just choreographers coming and then going away again and not having any impact with the territory. And then that thought went a little bit further on how they could have contact with me as a choreographer. And this is kind of what ties in with my work, because for some years I've been interested in like the idea of copy and authenticity in a choreographic work, in a dance work, like what is authentic. When I was younger, I was really struck by, I think I actually saw it one day, I saw a bit of my work on stage, or then I would see someone else's work, and I would start thinking about other choreographers when I was watching a choreographic work, and I became really intrigued about how we derived material and how we put it on the stage, how we organized it, how today I think we do not work with our dancers in a way that they are making every single movement, it's the inverse. We're not working in a way anymore when the choreographer is giving every single movement to the dancers, and then they are performing this on stage. I think I don't know anyone who is working like that today. And I guess my idea kind of pushes this a little bit further, where I really like to start work from a point of view where I'm asking other choreographers to either give me material or I borrow material, but I either ask them or I steal it. And I work with my dancers and kind of work on this quotation, like quoting other choreographers' work. And often we use this as a kind of like a creative thing for ourselves. So it's the material, but also how we respond to that material, like material that is not our own or secondhand, how that comes into our studio, and how we, I'm going to talk about it, how we get to know this material and how we respond to it. It's a bit of that goes on for me. So anyway, Exquisite Corpse, I had this idea to work on an exquisite corpse, which is, I think everyone is familiar with. How do you say that in German, Jochen? Cadavre exquis is the French term. And so in German, what is that? In English, we say also rotating corpse. So part of that, it's an old system. I mean, storytelling is a bit of an extension of this, so it's existed for centuries, but it was coined in the 1930s by the Surrealist French group, who really coined that term and put in place a series of writing, or it could be painting, or I don't know. I'm sure you've played that game as a child where someone draws a head and they fold the paper over and you have a little trace left over, and then you draw the body and then you fold the paper so you cannot see what is written there, and then you draw the legs and you end up with this kind of hybrid thing. So it's a bit of a questioning of the role of the author. The author is not the one who decides everything that goes into that picture, but they are using processes, because the Exquisite Corpse is a process, to engage other authors and to question the work, the role of the author. And so traditionally the Exquisite Corpse doesn't have one person who signs this work. But I didn't actually want to leave the process there, in fact, in proposing to set in place an Exquisite Corpse for 58 choreographers, including myself. I wanted to take that a little bit of a step further. So basically, how did this happen? I mean, I really encourage you to ask questions and stop me when I start babbling. I really like if there are questions that come up during what I'm saying. So feel free to interrupt and find ways to interrupt me. It's not a problem for me. I like it. So anyway, how did this work? So basically, I put in place a system where I approached a number of choreographers. Actually, in the beginning, it was more than 58 choreographers that I asked, because not all of the choreographers that I asked wanted to be part of the project, of course, because I was asking them to embark in a very specific process. So I guess I must have asked around 90 choreographers, and when I got my 58 choreographers who said, yes, I want to be part of that, I started the next step. And the next step was basically to find out how to coordinate this planning between the 58 choreographers, because the 58 choreographers were not all living, this will come as a surprise, they were not all living in Belfort. They were living, in fact, all over the world, and that's something that was, yeah, it interests me personally. I mean, we were just talking about that, me being born in Australia and living there and working there for 5 years, and then moving to London, and then moving to Brussels, where I worked for 18 years. So I became Belgio-Australian, and then now I live in France. And yeah, it's a bit of a question for me, like the cultural aspect of the work. And how I really like that thing that Deborah Jowett says, the American critic. She says that to understand a work fully, you need to know from which culture that comes from, like where that person is working and what their influences are. So this is also part of the influence myself in putting this project together and doing this kind of hybrid work between many different choreographers from many different places all over the world. I guess in kind of putting the territory in place, it was important for me to work with people who were essentially coming from a dance background and not from so much a theatrical background. It was one of the things. And also, I wanted to keep things kind of more or less in the contemporary dance arena. I didn't want to open that too much so that I would invite particularly a classical choreographer or, yeah, that was important for me to kind of put a territory in place and the people that I thought of asking. So anyway, all of these choreographers are a bit all over the world. There are choreographers from Australia, from Canada, from America, from France, from Germany, from Spain, from Belgium, etc. So they're kind of all over the place. And I felt that I shouldn't ask, I couldn't impose the order of the Exquisite Corpse. So basically the order of the choreographers, like from 1 right through to 58, was determined by their availability. So basically I worked with an administrator at the CCN, and we got in contact with all of the choreographers and found out when they were free. Because the idea was that I would make 1 minute of material, and then I filmed this material. I isolated the last 10 seconds of this material and I sent it to the next choreographer. And this choreographer had instructions to learn this material, to do it, and then to continue to 1 minute. So their material, their intervention, in fact, would be 1 minute and 10 seconds. And then they had to transmit this material back to me in any way that they wanted to, because it was also part of the question, like how we pass choreographic material from one person to another, or from one choreographer to another, or from a dancer to a choreographer. So it was up to each person to decide how they would transmit that material. Yeah. And they had 1 week, in fact, to make that material, to respond, and to get that material back to me. Because of course, if you add up yeah, the number of choreographers by 1 week were already over 1 year. So really quickly it became clear to me that it wasn't possible to leave the Exquisite corpse in one long chain, so I had to break it into 3 chains. If not, I would not have been able to coordinate the planning, the very, very busy, which is very reassuring, the very busy planning of the choreographers involved. So in fact, I broke this Exquisite corpse chain into 3 parts, and it always had the same beginning. And then the 20th choreographer had instructions not only to start from 10 seconds, do 1 minute, they had to end with 10 seconds of the first part of the Exquisite. Are you following me? Yeah? All of the interventions were for one body. So it was all solo material. And this material was often done by the choreographer themselves, or they worked with a dancer, or they worked with some other situation. Normally the instructions were that always the body or our body had to be present in whatever they passed, which of course it is, isn't it? I mean, even if you write a text, the body is present. I mean, so it's pretty hard to get away from that, I guess, but the idea was that the body was always present, which actually was really shocking when someone left the body out. The body left. I'll show you. Yeah. So, where am I? So, basically, these choreographers had 1 week to respond and get this material back to me. And then the idea was that this would form a kind of like a score. A lot of my work is putting in place systems or processes which develop a score from which myself and the dancers work. I should say right away, like as a choreographer, I don't go into the studio and start making material. I don't know how to do that, and I don't know what that is. What I'm interested in is putting processes in place and working with the dancers on how to develop and think about that material and how to kind of put that in place. And I think I made a kind of like a decision really early on with this piece, that it was really about how to combine this kind of like, I mean, you can imagine 58 different choreographers. We had this mass of material, and it was really for us like a kind of like a structural question as well, how we could give readability to this piece and this material, because we found that once we started doing this material, it kind of like erased itself straight away because there was just so much material all the time. And I think that there is so much material all the time, even in the piece that we made. It's very much part of the identity of the work. Just to say that the choreographers themselves, they had to, getting back to that, they had to transmit this material to us. So I don't know if there are ways that you can think how you would do that. If you had 10 seconds of material that was sent to you, either on a little film or on a text, like how you would send that back to me. How could you do that? I don't know if there are any ideas if you were making work on, like, to call on the choreographers or the people, the dancers, or even the general public, like how you could pass material from one choreographer to another. What would be the most traditional way that we would do that? Yeah. Yeah. I quite liked this quote that I'm putting up on the screen there for you, that traditionally, we say that traditionally dancers pass material from, like, the material exists in their memory, and we go into a studio and we teach it. Do you agree with that or not? Because actually, I don't think myself that actually we work like that anymore. I myself, I don't have the money to work like that anymore. If I have to replace a dancer, I rarely have the chance to bring another dancer in, the original dancer, and to teach the material body to body, or I don't necessarily know it as a choreographer, the other dancers don't necessarily know it. So often we kind of build up this series of like note-taking, film, And it's this often, because I find that my smartphone, my horrible smartphone, really helps me because it's really light and I can just get the material really quickly, load it into my computer and keep it. So actually, for me, I think that the way that I pass material, often when I'm passing a role or when I'm transmitting material, I think that I use a series of note-taking, of little films, and it's often not the entire work, it's often little fragments of specific material, and there's always these missing parts, you know, where I don't have the join that we really desperately need to see, even if we've had a kind of montage video, you know, like a video made of the piece. If we're working with an edit, or if I don't have like a single cut, I often find myself in a situation, and I'm sure that we all find ourselves in a situation where we just, yeah, we have lots of missing bits, and partly we either reinvent them, which I like as well, but I don't have this thing of like an existing work that I want to keep in process the whole time. I have this thing of this kind of like moving and evolving work the whole time, even with something that exists. So, yeah, so the choreographers, in fact, we ended up, you're right, thank you, with a lot of little films. We ended up with texts, like instructions that were written on paper. We ended up with some sound files where the choreographers chose to transmit their material by either verbal instructions. Once it happened that the film didn't work and we thought that it was just the sound of the dancer, so the next choreographer worked to the sound and he said, oh, this is really interesting, Joe. I'm working to a black rectangle and I've got the sounds. And I'm like, oh shit, it hasn't worked. So there were mistakes, which was part of our process. There was a packet of 58 photos which arrived in the post in Belfort that were all printed out, 10 by 15 glossy print photos that were taken to the rhythm of Schubert music. So it was like a photo a little bit quicker than 1 second. They were all, that arrived in the CCN. Photos and images were also part of the transmission. And question, thank you. Yeah, that's a really good point, because in fact I asked the choreographers really for material, but of course that brought into question how we work and what we need to make work, and often there were music that was present, but I was very free with either retaining that or not. And the sound composer, the composer for this piece, made the entire sound score out of remnants that came from the choreographers. So it was either using the textures on the little films that came on the mobile phone, or films that were downloaded from WeTransfer, or different ways of getting material. I've become a real expert in technology now. I can do anything for you. If you ever have a problem in converting those FLV files, you know, I've got everything. I really, you know, like 1 year of like receiving these little presents from choreographers. It was very wonderful, but it was very diverse in different formats. So yeah, all of the sound score for the piece was made out of textures and also suggestions. Sometimes there was music present. Often there was. You'll see. I will show you some of the interventions. And we felt we either incorporated that into our piece or not. Yeah. So it was this thing of like transmission, how we get material from one person to another. And there were 2 choreographers who came to Belfort. Oh, I should clarify one thing. I actually, as part of the process, we decided very early on to give a symbolic amount of money to each choreographer who was involved in the process, and that amount was 250 euros. And that wasn't a payment for their work. That was to acknowledge that the choreographer may have had a need to hire a studio, hire a dancer, everyone got that. And it wasn't payments. I want to clarify that really quickly. It wasn't payment for me. I never ever expected the choreographer to work for 7 days and 7 nights and send me back material. It was clear for me that and I hope clear for every choreographer, that it was very much a spontaneous kind of sense of play that we were involved in, where I would send them this 10 seconds and that they would have 1 week in question of time to get back to me. So yes, they had this amount of money. So it meant that, yes, there was a choreographer who bought himself a train ticket from Paris and came to Belfort. It was his proposition. So there were, yeah, like I say, 2 choreographers. Philippe Serre from Lausanne, he came to Belfort and he wanted to work with one of the dancers and to choreograph on one of the dancers. So he did that. He worked with Marion Carriot. Radouane El-Madeb, he came to Belfort and he worked with me and transmitted his material to me. He made something. And then we had another event where Edouard was working with one of the choreographers, Dominique Brun. He was working with her in Paris, and she was one of the choreographers involved in the process. And so they stayed on a bit longer, and she, you know, in the studio, and she composed on him. And he filmed that on his little mobile phone and brought that to us. So there was also that crossing over where dancers were also at times working with the choreographers involved I mean, by hazard, I guess. So I tried to keep the identity of the choreographers relatively private, not because I didn't want to communicate about that, but because I felt that it would be stupid if you knew that it was who can I say, Arco Rents, who had made the material, and then you continued on. Like, the identity of the choreographer was not necessarily involved in what they, like, present in what they gave. That kind of got out the window because the dancers themselves, I wanted to keep it even from them, that we didn't talk about, oh, this is X choreographer's material and this is another choreographer's material. I wanted them also to be kind of discreet about that, but they kind of went off and did their little, you know, like their research into, oh, recognizing the choreographer's sandals, and then, you know, like, it was quite funny. And so I just didn't want the piece, even though I guess it's inherent in, I cannot escape that, and I don't want to escape that. Of course, choreographers are involved in this piece, and there are 58 of them, but I didn't want it to be about this mega list of choreographers. For me, it was about a working process, and particularly important to get that material from author, like authors, like choreographer, or a dancer can be an author. It's not but an author, someone who considers. So for me, it's enough for someone to consider themselves an author. I don't have to have anything that goes with that. So all of the people involved in it were authors, and I tried to keep that relatively discreet. So here we are in the studio, and 1 year later, finally, I have not all of the chain. By the time we start working, I don't have all of the chain finished. It's still going on, it's still accumulating in the last series. So the dancers and I are in the studio, and initially I'm going to work with one dancer at a time. Like, each of the 3 chains were kind of like interpreted by one dancer at a time. And I did that because I wanted to have like a first kind of interpretation. So there for me, we already have a shift, like from, I don't know where the original material is. I don't know whether the score is the original material, or I don't know yet whether the first interpretation from the dancers is also another score. And it became a second kind of score. So the dancers were interpreting what was on all of those little films, on those texts, on all of those different sources that we discussed. And we tried to give kind of presence to that material in all its eclecticism. And knowing that, so we had basically kind of 20 solos that were joined each time by this 10 seconds of overlap. So that was first step. So we had original material, we had the interpretation of this original material, and then we worked on transmitting that material to the other dancers in the company, because there were 7 dancers involved in the process. And the dancers in the beginning, they asked specifically to learn the material body to body. So we came back now to a request from the dancers to learn the material from the first dancer, not from the original source material, which we found interesting, but it was a real, very specific thing for us. And so this dancer transmitted what they knew, or he knew, because it was 3 men, to the rest of the group. And of course, later we went back to the original material, and we consistently had to go back to the original little films and source material that were present in the studio the whole time. And then we kind of did these studies on this work, on how we could interpret that work and also develop kind of like knowledge about that material. Because the choreographers being from all over the world, we hadn't worked with Daniel Larieux for 16 years, although Jerome had worked with Daniel Larieux for 16 years. And so there was this other information that would come in about the choreographers. So we kind of developed this kind of almost like detectives, like working on our interpretation of what was going on. So there were films as well. And so us, when we're in the studio and we've got a little film, we know that we're missing a lot of information. We know that we don't have the complete picture, and that this film is a very poor rendition of what we're trying to get at. And we, if ever we got a little film from a choreographer, we interpreted that as the choreographer deciding to give us less information. We decided that if the choreographer came with us and worked with us, that the choreographer could spend basically as long as they want talking about what they were doing. So we intended, like for me, that was a position where if there was a film, it's like loss of information, which gave us the opportunity to project our own information onto that information that we could pick up from this fragment of work. So the interpretation was a big part of it. And then I would use the word appropriation. Do you use that in English? Appropriation. Yeah? So it's like owning the material. Like for me, the first step is interpreting. And it was like this kind of like aller-retour, this going and coming back over those two places of interpretation and appropriation. And I think that work is like that. I don't think it's like two separate stages. And now I'm interpreting, and now I'm owning it. And what do I have to do to own it? I think that those two things dialogue in work, and I look for that dialogue in between interpretation, to the point that I consider that if the dancers themselves are performing the work, for me, they have to be in a place where they can also propose, even on stage, something that is going on. So, and then we came to a point where it was necessary, and part of the project was also to respond. I talked about this earlier, so there was the response to this choreographic score and how we would work with that in the piece. Are there any questions before we go on to the next? Yes.
You said when the choreographer didn't give too much information, you had the freedom to find the dialogue. But what happened when the choreographer was very precise in what he wanted? Was this, it's a contrast, or what is there the freedom look like?
It's not that we particularly wanted to do that. We were obliged to project. If you have a film, and if that thing is, yeah, and I think it happens anyway, body to body. You are projecting on what you think that person is talking about, and you're trying to work that out continually. The most closed score, this is the score of Miriam Gorfink. And I don't know if you see that so well, but she gave us a whole kind of lexic on her notation, which is inspired by Laban notation, and then becomes her own particular way of notating dance. So it's one of the things we didn't mention, like our universal way of notating dance is by Laban or Benish notation. And the problem is you have to have done your studies in this to be able to interpret that. Miriam gave us a kind of like a user's guide, and this was part of what the choreographers were also asked to do. I asked them to accompany their intervention, their choreographic sequence, with a user's guide. So anything that the choreographer considered was necessary to know about their work in order for us to interpret it. So that was very interesting, seeing what they passed. Someone gave us a photo, nothing to do with the work. Other people gave us pages and internet links, and you know, wow. And yeah, so that was also part of the project. And this material was the most closed. It gave us very little room to do anything but what was written. Thank you very much for your listening.